Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Future of Funding podcast, where we welcome Camille Soulier. Thank you so much for joining me and being willing to share your thoughts. I'm going to pass it across to you to introduce yourself in a little bit better and more detail.
Thank you so much, Rizwan. I'm really happy to be here today. It's a topic that has kept me up at night, so really glad to share thoughts on the subject. So aside from working at SINGA on inclusion of newcomers, I'm also co-founder of UniR, which is an organization that supports access to higher education for refugees in France. And I'm now president of the board of this organization, which is a volunteer role, which means I actually have a full-time job as well. So I work for CFI, which is a French development agency that focuses on media development. And right now I'm heading a program in Benin, Togo, and Chad, mostly on media development and supporting journalists and building capacity in that sector in those three countries. So in general, I have a background in social entrepreneurship and NGOs, and I've been working on topics like freedom of the press, migration, inclusion, gender equality, and with organizations like Reporters Without Borders and SINGA, the organization that supports newcomer entrepreneurship in France. And I've been fundraising for all of these organizations until now. I'm no longer looking for the money, but I am handling the partner relations with the funder. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts.
You actually have a very long and pretty deep experience of working with funder, not just raising money, but then the whole journey of then managing that money as well and managing funding partnerships at quite significant scale as well, right? When you were working at Singa and certainly the project that you're working on now.
That's right. Yeah, so I have experience on fundraising from even the inception of an organization because I was responsible for raising the funds to launch UniR as well as scaling organizations, which is what I did with Singa. And now I'm working on the biggest project in terms of funding that I've ever worked on since it's a 10 million euro project over 5 years in these three countries. And it's really interesting for me as well because I've mostly kind of built my career on private fundraising with foundations or corporate sponsorship, that kind of thing. And now this project is funded exclusively by France's biggest public funder, which is the Agence Française de Développement, which is AFD, not to be confused with the German AFD. It's not the same thing, but this comes up a lot. Yeah, so really interesting turn of events in terms of donor relations for me.
What makes this particularly interesting is that I think you have quite a unique perspective in both being a fundraiser, but also being a leader of social enterprise and nonprofits and an executor.
Yeah, and project design as well, and within that fundraising scope.
Absolutely. So you've done quite a wide range. That's important because when you are able to look at funding from an execution lens, the insights are more powerful compared to simply deploying or raising it. Which leads us into a main starting point of this conversation. In all of your experience, what would you say are the top 3, 5 most helpful funding practices that you've encountered that really move impact forward and made your teams feel great?
Yeah. Well, since we're talking about people, right, I think our sector is all about creating impact and creating better societies. So I feel that there is kind of an interpersonal relationship aspect to it. And so having a positive human rapport, having empathy on the side of the funders really makes a difference for me. I feel in the way that you can express things. I think a relationship based on trust can make things way better because you're able to go over the types of obstacles that you may be facing without fear of retaliation in a way or fear of losing face or even worse than that, losing the funding. And I think this can only really happen within a framework of clear governance, which would ideally include light reporting only dedicated to keep you accountable, and impact indicators that are actually designed by the implementing organization rather than the funder. Of course, this one is super basic, but I feel like unrestricted funding really makes a difference. I would say that even some organizations that fund, for instance, administrative roles or roles that are usually considered back end, like a fundraiser role, for example, or a director role, even those organizations usually will apply some type of restriction that makes it complicated to fit into their box.
Would you have an example of that can make that feel a bit real?
Well, this organization isn't very outspoken, but they're called the Fidelity Foundation. They're part of an international group, and they have projects in Europe, the US, Asia, and they focus on supporting organizational development. And they really were an amazing opportunity when I was at SINGA and UniR as well, because at SINGA they helped us fund someone to build a organizational wide database, which we didn't have in terms of beneficiary tracking, which was really complicated. And at UniR, they helped us fund a fundraising position. So both really important roles that were very difficult to get funding for with more traditional, private or public donors.
How often would you say that you've seen this kind of unrestricted?
Very rarely, and I think this is much more of an American thing, maybe North American donor approach. I know that in Europe it's quite unheard of.
Really?
Yeah, completely. And there's a big difference also that you have to take into consideration, which is the amount of funding that is donated through US type grants compared to European grants. But certain restrictions that were imposed still made it complicated to find the right funder at the right moment to use the funding for what we actually needed. So even though it was, it's almost unheard of, super useful, you still have all these kind of organizational gymnastics.
Even in this case, even in the Fidelity
Even in this case, yeah. To be able to use the funding that was provided by Fidelity for this fundraiser role, it had to be a new hire. So we had to go find someone external because they had to prove that it was scaling, which is, I think, justifiable. But I feel like a lot of times organizations are asked to demonstrate how they're doing something new, just doing something that hasn't been done before within that organization to justify the need for funding.
This fund was to support organizational development as compared to an unrestricted fund as such.
Yeah.
So effectively, it's doing something very helpful, which is supporting organizational development. But that development then came with a number of restrictive conditions that then made it actually difficult to utilize it to best effect for that organization development.
And I feel like organizations aren't necessarily supported in their professionalization, and therefore that has a negative impact on outcomes. But the way to mitigate that isn't by restricting funding, but rather by providing the right type of support to come with that funding. So now I'm actually in a bit of a donor position myself because the project that I'm managing in Benin, Togo, and Chad has a grants component to it. So we have to identify grantees in these three African countries to set up media projects. And my experience as a fundraiser is pretty much that. Is that if we can provide unrestricted funding, but provide support with how to manage those funds, how to build competencies around not only managing those funds, but potentially leveraging them to get more funds, then that's when I feel as an enabler, as an organization that's enabling outcomes or impacts, you're doing your job.
Great. So far you talked about having trust and empathy inside of the funder, unrestricted funding, ideally, and that is accountable to outcomes rather than accountable to spend specifically, and then providing the right kind of support to go with that money, really help that nonprofit or that organization to create those outcomes, that end result. Were there any others on your list?
Multi-annual grants.
Okay.
The fact that funding is thought out on a medium to long term perspective, there is nothing more wasteful in my eyes than to have to renew funding every single year.
What would you say is an ideal or a sensible term?
10 years. People throw around the word systemic impact all the time, but then they give you funding for an 18-month project. I think 10 years is a realistic amount of time to actually see transformation or change. I would settle for 5 if you consider that the following 5 years you do actually have funding to work on impact measurement. So in terms of project implementation, I think, maybe 5 years is a decent amount of time to see change or to promote change. But then you have to keep in mind those extra 5 years to see where people are at 5 years later.
That's a very important point because when we talk about multi-annual grants, we've settled into a norm of 3 years as being furthest possible horizon that a grant could be provided for. And it doesn't even reach the minimum sensible timeline for a grant, let alone timeline that genuinely has potential for effectiveness. When you create an artificial time limitation that forces organizations into an annual wastage of effort just looking to raise money to stay alive. You also can't plan sensibly. You can't design sensibly. You can't settle into focusing on impact. You're too busy worrying about whether or not you can finance your operations for the next year.
Yeah, and I can give a concrete example of how that backfires because this is what UniR is going through right now, actually. We were finally at a position where we were able to scale, and now, because of the current economic conjuncture in France, abroad, everywhere, we're actually having to scale back quite significantly, and we're even in a very tough economic spot right now. We're having to lay people off, and it's hard for our organization and it's difficult for our staff, but it's not a question of ego. It's a question of what is actually happening in the field. All these people who are supposed to be able to count on our service can no longer do that. And so now all of our efforts are concentrated on looking for money to be able to make UniR survive and into 2026 instead of providing a really important services that contribute to, a better, more educated, more successful society. This is a massive issue because we've come at the end of a lot of 3-year grants. We're at the end of the cycle and yeah, it's not been possible to plan otherwise.
How does this affect you as leaders, as a team?
Well, I mean, it's really tough. A lot of people are disillusioned, because you do give so much. And I think it's true that people in our sector do give a lot because we're not just here to do a job, as much as I like to say that we are, but people do give, I think, more than is expected of them. And there is a satisfaction, of course, and it is gratifying. But the disillusionment is pretty big because you feel like you've been doing so much and providing so much and nobody cares really. So why should you keep going? Why should you keep trying to make this society better? There's a feeling of like, oh, it's all on your shoulders. No one else is doing anything to reach that type of, ideal world in which we want to live. But on the other hand, you have to have a level of pragmatism about it and keep going forward. I mean, the problem isn't going to solve itself, so we'll find a way.
That's right. Yeah. Talking of that, do you have any more good practices that made you feel great? Or shall we move on to the less helpful ones that follow in this vein?
Yeah, I think in terms of how funding actually is today, without going into what it should ideally be, yeah, I'm out of good practices.
I mean, that's a disappointing thing, isn't it? Reality for a lot of people when I speak to them. Very much that the overwhelming nature of that journey is heavily balanced towards leaving you generally demoralized and disillusioned as compared to looking at that as an exciting part of your impact journey.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very difficult role to carry. Part of the reason for which I changed jobs is because it does take a toll on you to feel like you're carrying an organization. Most small scale organizations don't have the resources to have a fundraising team, for instance. I think you have to really be at a certain level in terms of size to be able to have a fundraising team. People also confuse waste in public spending and nonprofit action. And I do see it in international development specifically, where there's so much impact being done by small, local civil society organizations in the countries where basically Western states send a lot of funding to the global South. And instead of actually being sent to and used by local civil society organizations that are having an impact at the local level, you can really see the funnel, all these intermediaries between where the funding starts and where the local organizations finally get it. It's huge.
I think that's a very important point, right? It's not fair to then point at the community and nonprofit
Yeah.
organization when money filters through state bureaucracies. That's really where you're going to see the maximum waste, right? Because that whole state bureaucracy is not, in fact, motivated for public good. Yeah, we have to be careful not to associate the wastage that flows through state mechanisms, international or regional, versus what's happening at an executor or a nonprofit or a community level.
Of course. And I think what you're saying about state mechanisms, I think the word mechanism is really important because systems and mechanisms at the state level are not built around impact outcomes. And so this leads into one of the aspects that I find unhelpful in terms of funding behaviors is the lack of understanding of what impact actually is. So funders, whether public or private, even though public funders seem like they want to position themselves into long-term goals. Everyone has these really long-term and societal or systemic or whatever change goals, but actually, most people are interested in output and short-term goals. And so it's especially frustrating because there's this unbalance between the discourse and what is actually expected when you read the fine print of a grant agreement.
And that underpins a lot of other resultant failures and challenges, right? Because you are talking a good talk about impact, but in the end, you're incentivizing outputs.
And it's a very commercial and utilitarian approach. We're getting people jobs, and so they're contributing. But what about well-being? What about all these factors that are not measurable from a financial or economic standpoint, but that are completely relevant in terms of positive outcomes and, if you think about it, overall system change. So in any case, for me, there's a lack of understanding of what impact really is. Another factor that I find unhelpful, since we're talking about impact, is related to the application process. When most funders, have call for applications, and then nonprofits can answer these call for applications, but organizations will just change the words that they use to describe what they're doing to be able to fit in the grant application boxes and find the money that they need to do their job, which means that there's necessarily going to be a non-alignment between the donor and the nonprofit in terms of results or impact expectations. And so this non-alignment is probably going to result in bad partner relations over the course of the grant period because from the get-go, we're not talking about the same thing. And so to me, all these time consuming application processes, because it does take a lot of time to apply for a grant, to in the end either not get it because there's no remuneration for the time spent on grants that you don't get, or end up having terrible donor relations. That's really unhelpful in terms of a funding approach.
When I talk to corporate people who have managed funds or people from foundations that have managed funds, they often have pretty poor experiences with grantees. And you wonder sometimes how much of those poor experiences are function or an outcome of the fact that the funder just didn't set up the conditions sensibly from their own end, and that the funder doesn't have any real idea what they're dealing with in the sense that they're operating in two completely different universes in terms of how much resources available, what technology is available, and so on and so forth. So when you have things that you just take for granted in your environment because there's enough resources to go around to do those little things, like expecting something the next morning and it's going to be good. That is not a luxury available to nonprofit organizations who are operating in a low resource environment. Low resource environments and high resource environments are fundamentally different and they have completely different norms. So if you're coming from a high resource norm, it's very easy to then end up with a very negative judgment about things that are happening in a low resource environment because you just think that that's happening because people are just lazy or they're inefficient or they're incompetent without realizing that that's just not a doable thing in their environment.
Yeah, and I've completely experienced that, especially in terms of reporting expectations. The level of information or detail that certain funders ask of nonprofits on beneficiaries it just doesn't make sense. I mean, we would need double whatever the grant is just for resources for reporting. You can't be expected to deliver the program and measure the program with the same amount of resources. And this, with the funder that you and I met, this was a very big issue. There really was just, I think it was steeped in miscommunication and misunderstanding of what the reality actually is in terms of working in a nonprofit compared to working in a corporate environment like an international insurer. We just don't have that many resources to be able to provide the amount of data or knowledge that is expected of us. So to me, it all comes down to due diligence, really. a grant application really should include a lot more direct exchanges rather than just a paper grant application or, a written grant application. I think you would avoid a lot of issues over the grant period if the approach was better at this phase.
I feel that is, in fact, probably the most important piece that is not being done well enough because it has such big implications for the downstream effectiveness of that growth, right? And talking about RFPs, good due diligence is typically then step outside that RFP altogether and then try to understand where that organization is, what it's really trying to achieve, and then trying to find a way to reconcile the funder to that and ensure that money, if deployed, is then deployed in a way that aligns with what that organization is really set up to do or is really trying to achieve, and then comes with a recommendation for what additional support that organization is going to need with that money. That's fundamentally how diligence should be done, and particularly with the factor that the diligence should add value to that organization. So if you are going to spend days, weeks, or months on it, the end result, even if you don't get that grant, should fundamentally improve your ability to raise money from other grants and or really improve your overall ability to make an impact. And when you do that, I don't think people begrudge the time that they spend in those due diligences. So I guess what I'm saying is the due diligence needs to be capacity building and not a one-way drain on nonprofit resources.
Yeah, this is exactly what happened at SINGA. So you and I met through a grant application that SINGA submitted to Generali, and the mentorship that you provided us was included not only in the due diligence, but then afterwards in the grant itself. And for me, I had never experienced due diligence process like the one that we had with this grant. And we did get something out of it. It does set you up for potentially further success.
What we try to advocate for is due diligences that really care about the recipient. So I'm happy that it was a good experience for you.
And I think this should be more of a generally applied approach in terms of funding. We're trying to survive in this economic context that is not easy. Fundraising is harder and harder in France at our level. But the way that these systems are set up doesn't really favor that. And I think this disconnect between organizations, nonprofits, and funders is actually my next point. I illustrated it with how boards change their minds on what topics are important to them from one mandate to the other. So I was talking about how 10 years would be the ideal amount of time for, reaching a certain amount of impact outcomes. This is clearly impossible today because foundations don't even have a 10-year lifespan in terms of what their topics of interest are. Every 3 years, the board or the mandate or whatever is renewed. And it's like, well, okay, great. So happy that we worked with you for 3 years, that we killed ourselves providing all this data. Because what are you even doing with the data? So to me, that's disconnect between what nonprofits are actually doing and what can seem from the nonprofit level as a whim, really. That's difficult.
What do you think drives that?
I think that it's because donor organizations don't really have a vision. And I think this is true of nonprofits as well. You see this in any impact organization, right? I mean, if you're set up with an idea of a problem that needs to be fixed rather than a world that needs to be something else, then it's easy to switch from one to the other because there are so many problems that do need to be fixed. I'm not saying that one issue is more valuable than the other. I'm just saying that you won't be able to actually address the issue if you're just throwing money at the problem for a couple of years. So I think this is something that we see less actually in public funding. In my current experience now, there are a whole lot of issues in terms of how much the administrative part takes precedence over the impact part. But at least there is a vision for the media being there to support democracy. At least we are doing things because we believe that the media is very important to maintain democratic systems.
I mean, media is the main reason why democratic systems are failing everywhere at the moment. So, yeah, they are very important because the opposite is also true. They are such a high risk to democracy as well.
Completely, but it means that something has to be done to protect free press, to protect independent press, especially now in terms of disinformation, fake news, etc. No, it's a really important topic, and I think that public funders who are in this space are very conscious of the fact that this is a long-term game. Much more, I find, than private funders who can change whatever they're doing every time the board is renewed, because you get a new set of people with a new set of ideas that are not integrated into a vision for an organization, but that are asked to overhaul or reestablish or bring a more positive image. Yeah, or make the organization itself shine, make the company itself shine, the company behind the private foundation. Maybe I'm talking mostly about corporate foundations rather than family organizations, but this has been my experience.
The corporate foundation is a huge part of the funding landscape.
Yeah, completely. And it should be more than a publicity tool.
Absolutely. So going back to your unhelpful practices, so far you talked about things that haven't been that helpful or one size fits all approaches, challenging restrictions in terms of how you can utilize or deploy money, systems and mechanisms that are not really built for impact outcomes and are more focused on outputs, for example. The challenge of having to keep changing what you say to fit different RFPs. So you can't really just put forward your planning and what you're already trying to achieve, but you have to find a way to keep aligning it to however funders have set up their requirements, which is very time consuming.
Yeah, to bring a little bit of nuance to that, I feel like this is very true of first time grants. So when you're approaching a new donor, you have to fit in those boxes. But after you build a relationship, then it becomes possible to just renew a grant based on what you're actually doing, not based on a little project that they want to see, but actually on what your organization is doing. So in my experience, that has actually been kind of a good practice that when once this kind of initial grant is successful, then you're able to go into more realistic approaches. But it's problematic that this is not the situation from the get-go.
Following on from that, we were also talking about helpful practices in terms of the level of information or detail asked for on beneficiaries, even reporting information that's not really funded by the amount of the grant. So it becomes very difficult then to meet that expectation. And so there's a disconnect in that. Misaligned expectations, you also mentioned, is a key foundation of unhelpful practices. Finally, the last really important point you made was around how that boards can and do change their mind on pretty short time. So they don't really have a very long-term vision, which means that it's almost impossible for nonprofit organizations that are working in a system like that to, in fact, establish systemic timeline planning. So you have to be caught up in a tricky place, I guess, where you're expected to achieve systemic change, but you're operating within a restrictive system that makes it almost impossible for you to realistically plan on that kind of systemic time, just because of the fact that you are constantly having to adjust to short term money.
That's right. And it's confusing to me because if you see this in terms of an investment, if a grant is an investment, then why are we applying such a different time frame to this investment, to this grant investment, as opposed to other commercial investment? I mean, either you have high risk and high return, or low risk and low return. So I don't see why this principle, which is so broadly accepted when it comes to financial gain, isn't when it comes to impact gain.
And what's particularly interesting here is that there is very little risk for the funder, right? In a context like this, it's not like you are putting in your life savings as a funder. This is surplus money that you've put aside anyway. So even if it doesn't result in what you were aiming for, there's no real risk to you as an individual or as an organization.
Maybe that's the problem.
But that is absolutely part of the problem, isn't it? The fact that there is so little risk to you also means that you feel no pain, which means when it suits you, it doesn't really matter whether the foundations you support, they genuinely are, in fact, succeeding in their impact, unless you are holding yourself or somebody else is holding you accountable for ensuring that that money does, in fact, result in impact. And this is what boards and things are supposed to do. But if the power player doesn't fully understand impact, and either they already prefer outputs or they see outputs as valid, or they don't understand it either way. And then the doer or their intermediating team that they've tasked with that money, because that's the issue. I'm a board member, I put money forward, I hire a bunch of people, and actually their necks are on the line for whether that money makes an impact more than the non-profit at the other end. That intermediating team then is incentivized to present the easiest tickable thing as success. But then that cascades to the nonprofit, then everybody ends up looking to generate outputs. And nobody is really thinking about the effects of those outputs. That's why you can look at 3 years as a pretty long time for outputs, but it's a negligible time to see effects of outputs. And that
Absolutely.
fundamentally is what we should be qualifying as impact, not the outputs themselves.
Absolutely. I just don't think that that's how, especially corporate foundations, are set up. It's all about the donor's interest. And I think this is true at public and private donor level. Right now, what I seem to be hearing from a lot of people is that, well, public funding for international development should really be serving French people. How is funding media abroad a positive thing for French people? Because it's French taxpayer money or European taxpayer money, but that's not the point. The French taxpayer today probably isn't going to benefit directly as an individual from this. But because it's all about getting votes and remaining in office, then the goal in the end is not for the taxpayer. It's for the person who wants to remain in office. So they're not even worried about whether public funding for international development is benefiting taxpayers. They're worried about whether it's benefiting their image.
Yeah. Because in practice, that international development has a massive value proposition for the taxpayer because you're basically creating a global economy that allows for bigger markets and better security and better opportunities to travel and better safety globally and peace. And there's a number of these things that result in a lifetime value as compared to an immediate return on that investment. And I think that, again, the overall short termism of everything from money to politics does mean that fundamentally damaging and limiting long term value propositions. And I think that's the parallel with impact, right? By focusing on short term outputs and problem solving instead of long term vision and impact, you're often hindering the ability of the system to, in fact, create that systemic change that you actually want.
Completely. And I think there's a confusion on roles in terms of organizations. For example, I'm not sure that nonprofits should be solving unemployment. To me, this is something that pertains to government services. Government should be solving day to day unemployment for citizens. A lot of nonprofits are actually rendering public services there because, the state is lacking in this or that area. But it really shouldn't be a nonprofit's role. Basically, governments or public funders are delocating the responsibility onto nonprofits. But is it really the nonprofit's responsibility to make sure that, for example, newcomers or refugees have jobs? I'm not sure, because then should we also be the ones who decide how migration policies are made? Because maybe if you're going to give the responsibility, you should also be giving the tools. So I think there's a disconnection there.
Well, there's an interesting piece there because that execution is being passed on by the same player that is also then obstructing the execution. So we have an interesting set of conundrums that we face as nonprofit leaders and doers. And I guess on that note, then, how would you envision better funding that is more effective and more capable of genuinely creating the impact that we all aspire to?
I mean, I think it all comes down to one thing, right? These obstacles all stem from the fact that funding is not really designed for impact first. It funds organizational benefits or image or tax breaks or problem fixing. But I mean, why is funding restricted? Why is it over such short term periods? It's because the way that it's designed is doesn't correlate to what the expected impact or outcome should be. And to me, that's the main problem. So, in an ideal world, funding would be directly correlated to system change, to a systemic impact, and there would be long term visions associated to funding. And that's really the core underlier for me.
What I'd love to do is to get you to open that up a little bit more and then describe what that look like. So we have the core principle that funding should be designed for impact first rather than other goals or priorities, and impact continuing really for systemic change. So we're reimagining funding that is genuinely designed for systemic. Once we've set that as the foundation, what does that look like?
I think maybe part of the answer for me would be that even the setting up of a donor organization should be made with nonprofits. Let's take the example of a corporate foundation. When thinking about creating a new funding mechanism, they should be consulting nonprofits and potentially other experts in the sector, but definitely nonprofits. And I think that they should be hiring nonprofit professionals within the funding organizations. I don't believe that you can work your entire life in a corporate environment and then be given the task of setting up a foundation and expect your foundation to position itself in an impact framework. I think it takes skill, it takes knowledge, expertise of the impact sector, and therefore there should be way more overlap even at the design phase of any new funding mechanism.
How often do you see this in practice?
Quite rarely. The Hermes Foundation in Paris hired a person with a nonprofit background to manage the foundation. He had a very clear idea of what he wanted the funding to go to in terms of objectives, but it was entirely left up to us to suggest what we wanted to do to reach those objectives. I think it was difficult for him because there was also a lot of push on certain aspects from the Hermes group. So he was kind of stuck in between, but it was nice to be able to speak to a peer when discussing impact and program objectives and stuff.
So that's one aspect. Setting up should be made either consulting with, but ideally hiring nonprofit professionals rather than having corporate experience as the primary decision makers. How else would you say that funding should be designed for
I
systemic
mean,
change?
setting up 10-year cycles, making it impossible for this switch to another extremely niche topic. Because another thing that I often see are donors who come to their partners and they're like, oh, well, we've decided that we were going to support only organizations that set up tech solutions for environmental issues, which is super specific. And they're like, oh, but we can't find any. Well, yeah, because you didn't consult before setting up what you thought should be done. This happened to me 2 years ago, this specific example. So I think a 10-year time frame over every topic and avoid being so niche. I think you have to have flexibility in terms of what exists. There are a lot of solutions out there, and yet so many donors want to act as incubators for new initiatives. So I think it's all part of due diligence, I guess. Not just a due diligence on the partner that you want to work with, but a sector due diligence.
And that's what should come actually at your portfolio strategy end, right? So you have, it's a very interesting point you're just making about that there are two levels of due diligence. There's the level at which you enter the system altogether, or you periodically understand what's happening in that system. So you're looking at the sector of that particular systemic issue. There's a due diligence that needs to be done there. It needs to be maintained over time. And then there's a due diligence that needs to be done at the actual selection of the partners that become part of your portfolio.
And I think that nonprofits should be able to run due diligence on the funders that they work with too. But we're so strapped for cash. And to be honest, we don't have the resources. I mean, we can do a little Google and then word of mouth, right? Ask around.
I think when we're talking about the fact that, correct me if I'm wrong, that there needs to be systems of visibility and accountability for funders
Yes, absolutely.
that nonprofits can lean on, because there's such a ongoing conversation about the power dynamic being skewed between funders and nonprofits. And the assumption, of course, here is that it's because the funder has money and the nonprofit doesn't. But I think the real reason is that the funder has no shortage of means of holding nonprofits accountable, while the nonprofit has no means of holding funders accountable. And this applies to absolutely anything from promises not kept to delays in release of money to failure to release money altogether to pulling out of contracts to changing priorities to other, egregious or unethical behaviors that funders may engage in, even things that require arbitration or should really have arbitration, where funders take a position that is unfair to the nonprofit. One of the things that this implies is that the future of funding should really see the creation of these ombudsmen or arbitrators or intermediating systems that allow the doer part of the sector to hold funders accountable. And talking of things like due diligence, there isn't even a place like a glass door where nonprofits can really go and look at whether those funders are in fact trustworthy or worth working with or are just going to make their lives miserable.
Yeah, I completely agree. There should be an accountability system for funders, if only to keep themselves ethical.
An example would be things like consumer rights systems, right? Where there are arbitration mechanisms. An example would be years ago, I was not happy with the fact that Microsoft sold me a laptop that had to be repaired twice in the first 6 months. And they were not going to replace the laptop. So I was able to take them to a local arbitration. So then somebody from Microsoft had to turn up, and then I was awarded a new laptop. If you look at a lot of global south environments, it's a real issue because if you buy something from someone, you can't get it refunded
Yeah.
or returned if it doesn't work. And that creates a huge trust deficit in that system, right? It means that that organization can get away with whatever it wants to sell you. But that's a good example of mechanisms that make it visible and embarrassing enough for those companies to actually do the right thing. And I think that's the same piece here, where there's so much potential for the nonprofit's image, reputation, and brand to be wildly discredited by power
Yes.
players, but there's no mechanism for a nonprofit to have a fair ruling made that is then publicly visible. These are kind of things that you don't need to leverage specifically for bigger players to start behaving more considerately. Just the fact that it exists creates a change in what they feel they can get away with.
But actually, today, bad behavior on the donor's part reflects more poorly on the NGO that takes money from them than on the donor itself. We've had that example where we realized one of our funders was potentially or allegedly engaging in slavery, human trafficking, I believe. And we decided to cut the grant short to renounce the funding. But we didn't do anything public about it. We just wrote an email. We don't feel like we can work with you guys anymore. So thanks for the first year. Here's the report. We're out. Bye.
Right? You can't afford to do that because otherwise it's like being a whistleblower. People don't look at you, well, okay, they've done the right thing. People just look at you like, well, hold on,
Yeah. Oh, well, we don't want to work with them.
which is a fundamental reason why I feel there needs to be independent intermediaries that the system hands that power to. This is
Yeah.
ideally funders themselves set up. If I was a funder, I would set it up. It's like being the CEO of an organization and recognizing that you're a key power player in there. So if you're creating an escalation system, the escalation system should bypass you. And there has
Completely.
to be
Yeah.
a way for that escalation system to also bypass the board members if those board members are behaving in ways that are contravening whatever the zero tolerance policies of that organization is. So the whole escalation system has to be able to exit the organization altogether in an
Yeah.
ideal
Completely.
world
Yeah.
for players in that system at the grassroots level to genuinely feel that there's a potential for justice. And that keeps everybody accountable in a good way, but it also means that you can't then arbitrarily just point fingers at people because they also have the potential to have the arbitrator rule on their behalf.
Hmm.
So it is fair for everybody. Otherwise, it's very easy to just assume that because you're the CEO, therefore you're there to abuse power. So actually, it works well for everybody.
Yeah, and I feel like there has been a lot of criticism on philanthropy in general. Why is it that very rich individuals in the Western world, mostly in the United States, get to dictate what development priorities are in the global South? I think this is something that's been in the conversation for a long time. And I feel like a system that holds everyone accountable that is positioned within a long-term vision in terms of impact, and that includes civil society organizations from the get-go, would definitely be able to make the money that goes from these very high net worth individuals in the West to the global South more ethical.
What's very interesting is the problem is more an issue of socioeconomics in general, because the same criticisms apply equally to wealthy donors in those countries. India's a good example. There's a host of new foundations that have come up in the last decade, all of which are run by industrialists, essentially financing what they think would be a good idea. And they are marginally more aware of reality on ground than anybody further away. I mean, yeah, they have slightly better local context, but growing up upper middle class in Mumbai tells you absolutely nothing about a tea farmer in Assam. So you feel like, sometimes it's a bit tough on Western industrialists or whatever, but the premise is very much the same. The answer lying in the inclusion of actual grassroots practitioners and doers in the design and decision making cycle. The moment you do that, it's a complete game changer for how that money is then deployed. So going back to just the nutshell of what you're talking about here, you were talking about the fact that funding needs to be designed for impact first, systemic impact at a systemic change level. And therefore, setting up the donor organization should really be made with nonprofits, consulting them, or ideally, really hiring nonprofit professionals as the key decision makers and executors rather than corporate experience, setting up 10-year cycles that prevent switching to arbitrary new mandates in the middle of, and really does align that fund with some kind of long-term systemic change, coupling that with avoiding being unduly niche, doing due diligence on the sector first, so you really understand what you're dealing with or what problem that you're really trying to address with that money. And then we talked a little bit about the fact that nonprofits also should be in a position to be able to evaluate the funders that they are accepting money from. So information needs to be visible there. There's some transparency there that needs to exist. But on the flip side, that we extended that into nonprofits also being able to hold funders accountable and to be able to get fair justice when that justice is due in terms of when and how money is being made available to them based on promises made. So that's where we were. What else would we add to that, impact first funding?
I think, as I said earlier, to me, what it comes down to really is this question of vision and what you put worth on above all. And I think that as long as what really matters the most is the vision and the society or the world that we want to live in, then it can't just be based on good intentions, but rather a well thought out, well designed society that we aspire to live in. And from that point, you can work backwards into designing something efficient and something meaningful. So if this is what is expected of nonprofit impact organizations or, civil society organizations, then I think donors should be held to the same standard.
I think that's a really great closing point. The fact that if nonprofits are being expected to meet certain standards and expectations, then funders and donors should also be looking to hold themselves accountable to those same standards and the same ways of functioning and operating. So, on that very helpful and interesting note, I would like to say thank you so much for your time today. It was very, very illuminating, and I'm sure will prove to be very interesting for funders who are looking to build better and more impactful ones. So thank you so much for being here today.
No, thank you so much for having me. This was really great. This is a topic that's really important to me, and I can't wait to hear the other episodes of the podcast as well.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Kamit.
Bye.